When you think about silence in relationships, particularly with avoidant individuals, it's not just a lack of conversation. It's not simply forgetting to send a text or failing to respond to a question. It's something much deeper and much more calculated. Avoidants often use silence as a shield. They believe, often unconsciously, that if they retreat far enough into themselves, they can avoid the vulnerability, the perceived chaos, and the risk of being hurt. Silence becomes a weapon they wield to keep emotional distance. For the avoidant, silence is rarely accidental. It's not simply about running out of things to say or needing a break from conversation. It's a psychological fortress built to keep emotional threats at bay. This silence is deliberate, even if unconscious. It serves as a shield, protecting them from the perceived dangers of vulnerability, intimacy, and emotional exposure. At its core, it's about control, controlling the flow of connection so they never feel overwhelmed, trapped, or obligated to reciprocate emotions they're not ready to face. This coping mechanism often develops in early life, when emotional closeness felt unsafe or unpredictable. For someone who grew up associating intimacy with pain, rejection, or criticism, silence becomes a survival tool. When emotions run high or when closeness becomes too intense, the avoidant withdraws, not to punish the other person necessarily, but to protect themselves from feelings they don't yet know how to process. In this way, silence becomes their armor, their method of retreating into a private space where no one can intrude. However, this silence is not neutral. It communicates volumes, even if the avoidant hopes it will go unnoticed. To the other person, the absence of words can feel like abandonment, rejection, or indifference. But for the avoidant, it feels like a safe retreat. They believe that by stepping back and saying nothing, they can preserve their autonomy and regain emotional control. It's a pause that allows them to breathe, but it's also a barrier that keeps others at a distance. What makes this coping strategy so complex is that it often backfires. While the avoidant intends to use silence as a protective measure, it can inadvertently create the very problems they're trying to avoid. Prolonged silence can erode trust, increase emotional distance, and cause the other person to question the stability of the relationship. Over time, it teaches others that closeness is unsafe or unreliable, reinforcing the cycle of detachment. In moments when silence becomes their default, the avoidant is often unaware of how much it says about them. It reveals their discomfort with sustained intimacy, their fear of emotional dependency, and their preference for self-reliance over connection. It's not that they don't feel, it's that feeling is dangerous in their internal narrative, and silence is their chosen safeguard. Yet, this coping mechanism comes at a cost. Silence can protect them in the short term, but it can also isolate them in the long term. It creates a gap that may never close unless they develop healthier ways to manage vulnerability. For those in a relationship with an avoidant, understanding that this silence is rooted in fear, not necessarily malice, can help depersonalize it. But it also means recognizing that until the avoidant confronts that fear, silence will remain their primary defense. For the avoidant, silence often feels like the perfect solution when emotions run high or intimacy begins to feel overwhelming. By withdrawing and refusing to engage, they create a controlled environment where no emotional demands can touch them. In the short term, this withdrawal offers a deep sense of relief. They believe they have regained their power, avoided vulnerability, and prevented themselves from being pulled into an emotional current they can't handle. In their mind, silence equals safety, and safety equals control. This control is intoxicating in the moment. It allows them to dictate the pace of the relationship without having to negotiate or risk emotional exposure. They don't have to answer difficult questions, confront uncomfortable truths, or respond to expressions of need. It's a clean escape from tension, at least temporarily. From their perspective, it's a way of protecting their autonomy while avoiding conflict or perceived emotional entanglement. But this control is an illusion, and its effects are fleeting. While they may feel in charge at the moment, the longer silence stretches, the more it begins to chip away at the foundation of connection. Human relationships are built on communication, responsiveness, and emotional reciprocity. Without these elements, even the strongest bonds weaken. Over time, the other person may begin to feel ignored, dismissed, or undervalued. What the avoidant sees as self-protection, the other person experiences as neglect. The irony is that by using silence to maintain control, they actually lose it. In the early stages of withdrawal, they may believe the other person is waiting patiently on the other side, ready to resume connection whenever they decide to re-engage. But as days, weeks, or months pass, that assumption often proves false. People adapt to emotional absence. They learn to live without the connection they once craved. The avoidant may return expecting the same dynamic, only to find that the other person has moved on emotionally, set boundaries, or closed the door entirely. The short-term relief they gain from silence blinds them to the long-term consequences. In their desire to avoid discomfort, they unknowingly trade closeness for distance, trust for uncertainty, and connection for isolation. By the time they realize the damage, it is often too late to repair. Silence, once their chosen form of control, becomes the very reason they have no control over whether the relationship survives. This pattern can become self-reinforcing. Each time silence works in the moment, by giving them space or ending a conflict, they are more likely to use it again. But each repetition deepens the fracture. Over months or years, relationships built on this cycle become fragile, easily broken by even minor conflicts. In the end, the avoidant may look back and realize that what they mistook for strength was actually a slow erosion of connection until there was nothing left to hold on to. Human connection is not simply a social preference. It is a biological necessity embedded into the human nervous system. From the moment we are born, our survival depends on the presence of others, caregivers, protectors, companions who provide not just physical needs, but emotional security. The brain is wired to seek safety through closeness, and this instinct does not disappear in adulthood, no matter how much a person convinces themselves otherwise. Even those with avoidant tendencies who appear to prefer solitude and emotional distance cannot fully escape this wiring. They can ignore it, suppress it, or distract themselves from it, but the need remains quietly pulsing beneath the surface. When an avoidant withdraws, they may initially feel a sense of relief. The demands of closeness are gone. They are free from emotional conversations, from vulnerability, from the unpredictable reactions of another person. In this space, they may believe they have finally achieved what they crave most: independence, without interference. But over time, something begins to shift. The human nervous system, starved of connection, starts to send signals of discomfort. Loneliness, though often unacknowledged, begins to seep in. This is not simply an emotional experience. It is a physiological one. Studies on isolation show that it triggers the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain, proving that disconnection is experienced as a real form of distress. For the avoidant, this hunger for connection is often masked by distractions. Work, hobbies, casual encounters, or excessive independence framed as self-sufficiency. But underneath these surface-level activities, the attachment system is still active, quietly pulling them toward others. It may emerge in subtle ways: a longing glance at a couple holding hands, a sudden wave of nostalgia when remembering an intimate moment, or a restless sense that something essential is missing. They may not call it emotional hunger, but that is exactly what it is: the body and mind craving the safety and warmth of human closeness. The longer they resist, the more this hunger grows. At first, it might feel like a faint emptiness, something they can brush aside. Eventually, it can become an ache that no amount of isolation or distraction can fully soothe. This is the point where many avoidants begin to feel conflicted. They want connection, but they fear the vulnerability it requires. This internal battle between the biological pull toward closeness and the learned defense of withdrawal creates a deep emotional tension that is exhausting to maintain. Ironically, the very act of withdrawing to feel safe ends up making them feel less safe over time. Humans are social creatures, and safety is not found in total isolation, but in the presence of trusted relationships. The absence of this presence leaves them exposed not to the dangers they fear from intimacy, but to the gnawing loneliness and emotional malnutrition that come from denying their own wiring. Eventually, even the most self-protective avoidant will find themselves facing the truth. No matter how far they run from connection, the hunger for it always follows. The realization point for an avoidant is rarely a sudden epiphany. It's more like a slow, creeping awareness that something essential has shifted. In the early stages of withdrawal, their silence feels like a shield. It spares them from uncomfortable conversations, emotional exposure, and the unpredictability of another person's feelings. But silence also creates a quiet expectation in their mind that the other person will always be there waiting. They count on the emotional safety net of knowing that, even if they pull away, someone is still holding on. This unspoken assumption gives them a sense of power and security. Over time, however, they start to notice subtle changes. The messages become less frequent. The check-ins stop. The emotional energy they once took for granted begins to fade. At first, they may dismiss it, believing the other person is simply busy, distracted, or giving them space. But eventually they realize the truth. The pursuit has stopped. The safety net they once relied on is gone. There are no more reassurances, no more reminders of their worth in the eyes of that person, no more predictable comfort waiting in the wings. This moment is unsettling, even for someone who prides themselves on independence. Without that external validation, the avoidant is left alone with themselves, and the silence they once controlled now feels like a weight pressing in. The freedom they valued starts to taste like abandonment, not because the other person betrayed them, but because they quietly walked away. This is when the avoidance coping mechanism begins to backfire. The very silence that once made them feel in control now leaves them exposed to the reality that relationships are not one-sided. The absence becomes more than a lack of contact. It becomes a mirror. It forces the avoidant to confront what their silence has cost them: connection, trust, and the unique comfort of knowing that someone truly saw them, flaws and all, yet chose to stay. They begin to realize that their emotional safety net was not a given, but a gift, and it has been removed not out of spite, but out of self-preservation by the other person. This awareness is often accompanied by a deep discomfort, because it means the avoidant can no longer hide behind the illusion that they are unaffected. They may notice a quiet longing for the very connection they pushed away. Old memories surface, not just of physical presence, but of the emotional bond that once existed. And in that realization comes the first cracks in their defense. The loss of the safety net doesn't just hurt because it's gone. It hurts because it reveals the truth that they were never as invulnerable as they believed. The silence they chose now feels like a prison of their own making, and for the first time, they are left wondering whether breaking it might be the only way to escape. Regret for the avoidant does not arrive like a lightning strike. It emerges slowly, like a shadow stretching across every thought they have about the relationship. At first, they may tell themselves they're fine, that the space they created was necessary, that they were only protecting themselves. But over time, the reality sets in. The person they once kept at arm's length is no longer within reach. The dynamic has shifted, and no amount of rationalization can erase the truth that their silence played a decisive role in that change. Regret begins with small realizations. They remember a message they didn't respond to, thinking they'd get back to it later. They recall moments when they could have spoken up, but chose not to. Each memory becomes a quiet reminder that their silence wasn't neutral. It was a message in itself, one the other person eventually learned to understand as disinterest or rejection. In the avoidance mind, these moments accumulate into a heavy awareness. What once could have been repaired is now irreversibly altered. Psychologically, this regret is complex because it challenges the avoidance core defenses. Avoidant attachment is built on the belief that emotional closeness is risky. The dependence on others leads to disappointment or loss of self. But regret exposes the cost of that belief, not in theory, but in lived reality. It forces them to confront the fact that the distance they maintained to feel safe has become the very reason they are now unsafe emotionally. The protective wall they built wasn't just keeping others out, it was keeping love, care, and connection from getting in. This kind of remorse is also amplified by the permanence of the loss. When a relationship is still salvageable, an avoidant can reassure themselves that they have time, that if they ever want to, they can step back in and reestablish the connection. But once the other person has truly moved on, the safety net disappears. The avoidant is left with the unchangeable fact that their silence didn't just create space, it created a void. And now that void is filled with absence they cannot reverse. Regret becomes most powerful when it collides with memory. The avoidant starts replaying moments of warmth, laughter, shared vulnerability, times when the connection felt effortless and genuine. These memories stand in stark contrast to the emptiness they now experience, making the loss feel even more pronounced. They may even find themselves longing for the very intimacy they once feared, realizing too late that the discomfort of closeness was a small price to pay compared to the pain of losing it altogether. In the end, the psychology of regret for the avoidant is not just about missing a person, it's about recognizing the role they played in their own loss. It's the painful understanding that their silence wasn't just a passive choice, it was an active force that reshaped the relationship, and once that shift became permanent, no amount of wishing, thinking, or self-protection could undo what was done. That awareness, more than anything else, is what makes their regret so deep and enduring. For some avoidants, regret does not merely linger as a painful reminder of what's been lost. It becomes the very spark that forces them to turn inward and confront the patterns that brought them here. This shift from avoidance to awareness is not instantaneous. It is often uncomfortable, drawn out, and filled with resistance. But when the loss is significant enough, when the emotional landscape they are left with feels barren and cold, something inside begins to question whether the old ways of coping still serve them. At first, awareness creeps in subtly. They may catch themselves noticing the similarities between this loss and previous ones, realizing a pattern has been quietly repeating throughout their relationships. They remember friendships that faded because they pulled back too much, romantic connections that ended when they couldn't meet the other person halfway, moments when vulnerability felt too risky so they chose withdrawal instead. In these moments, a new thought starts to emerge. Maybe the problem isn't always the other person. Maybe part of it is them. This is a difficult truth to face because it directly challenges the avoidant's long-held belief system. For years, their survival strategy has been built on minimizing emotional exposure, staying self-reliant, and keeping others at a safe distance. These defenses have not just been habits, they've been essential to their sense of security. Awareness, however, begins to show them that while these strategies may have protected them from rejection or dependency in the short term, they've also protected them from experiencing the depth of connection they secretly crave. As awareness deepens, they begin to feel the tension between their fears and their desires. They want closeness, but they're afraid of it. They long for understanding, but they're wary of being seen too deeply. This internal conflict becomes a turning point, one where they must decide whether to continue living in the safety of isolation or to step into the uncertainty of vulnerability. For some, the pain of regret outweighs the fear, creating a willingness to try a different path. This is where real change can begin. An avoidant who chooses to confront their fears starts by acknowledging their emotional limitations without shame. They might begin therapy, read about attachment styles, or have honest conversations with people they trust. They learn to recognize their instinct to withdraw and pause before acting on it. They start practicing small acts of vulnerability, testing the waters of connection without running at the first sign of discomfort. Over time, the shift from avoidance to awareness can fundamentally alter how they approach relationships. They realize that protecting themselves by staying distant is not the same as protecting their happiness. They see that intimacy, while messy and unpredictable, is also the very thing that gives life meaning. And though the regret that sparked this transformation may never fully disappear, it becomes a quiet teacher, reminding them that the cost of emotional safety can sometimes be far greater than the risk of opening up. Silence can feel like a fortress to the avoidant, but in truth, it's a prison. It protects them from short-term discomfort at the expense of long-term fulfillment. When they finally face the emptiness that silence leaves behind, the regret is not just for losing a person, it's for losing the moments, the words, the intimacy they never allowed themselves to have. And perhaps the deepest tragedy is realizing that the very thing they feared, vulnerability, was the key to the connection they will now spend years wishing they had preserved.